Germany started World War II on the offensive, snatching up most of Europe in blitzkrieg style. But as the Allies regrouped, she soon found herself playing defense, protecting herself from the waves of bombers burning down her cities and destroying her industry. Outnumbered and with dwindling resources, Germany's designers relied on their resourcefulness to create new breeds of miniature fighters. Without a doubt, the most ambitious of all German miniature aircraft conceived during the war was the Bacham Natter. This true vertical takeoff point defense fighter was one of the most complicated designs ever to fly, however briefly. The Natter was unique even amongst other unusual aircraft. Firstly, it was never actually commissioned by the RLM. It was an idea they had declined earlier. The project was adopted unilaterally by the infamous head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler.
It was clear that Himmler wanted to take the Natter under his control. At this stage, Himmler's power was in the ascendancy. He wanted the SS to take over armament development. Himmler offered to support Bacham, and Bacham accepted.
It was Himmler who authorized all the costs and even the building of the factory where the aircraft were to be assembled, as well as the actual construction of the individual aircraft, albeit under qualified supervision. The Natter would have been a true point defense fighter, much like another German rocket craft of the time, the Me-163 Comet. Its job was to defend specific targets critical to the war effort, although in many ways, the Natter could be seen as an answer to accuracy problems with earlier German missilery. With the Natter, a pilot could launch large numbers of missiles close to the enemy with great accuracy. Bacham's invention was perhaps more of a missile carrier. Though the Comet and Natter were both point defense fighters and used Walter rocket engine power plants, that's where the similarities ended. The Comet made a quick horizontal run before going almost vertical. The Natter, on the other hand, was simply fired on a ramp that was aimed in a totally vertical position. Due to the additional power needed to launch in a vertical position, similar to the Julia, 4 extra detachable solid-fueled rockets were added. Comets were particularly vulnerable to Allied fighters on takeoff, and even more so on landing. For this reason, the Bacham Natter's vertical takeoff ramp was designed such that it might be hidden in a wooded area, in the same way certain V-2 missiles were. Apart from its potential for clandestine takeoffs, a major reason for Himmler pursuing what was really a private venture was the Natter's weapons payload. The nose section was filled with the A6M folding fin air-to-air rockets, fired in a salvo. There was simply no possible antidote for these terrible, deadly weapons.
The R4M rocket missiles, when they struck a bomber, it wasn't a question of damaging it or downing it, it was a question of disintegrating the entire thing.
Allied concerns about the effectiveness of the A6M were such that advancing ground armies were under special orders to capture and destroy these weapons at all costs. Takeoff and attack were a precarious enough procedure for pilots, but descent was no easier.
The Natter for me is utterly fascinating. It was designed in such a way that it would actually come apart in flight after its engine had cut. At a certain height, the pilot was able to get out of the front part on his own and come down with a conventional parachute. The engines would come down by its own parachute. What that did was ensure that the whole thing could be reused, man and machine. And the interesting parallel that I draw is really it's the precursor of the space shuttle concept. You have a crew, you have an aircraft, it goes up, it does a job, but it comes back to Earth again and can be reused. And it's ahead of its time.
There were 36 Natters completed, although many were used as gliders to test the type's handling properties in the post-attack glide situation. There was only ever one attempt at a manned launch, and that resulted in the death of its young pilot. The designer, Erich Bacham, always claimed he never saw the Natter as a suicide mission. However, the risks of flying such a complicated machine were self-evident, and probably why the RLM declined and Himmler did not. Early in the war, de Havilland had developed its iconic Moskito twin-engine fighter bomber. The type's performance was greatly respected by the Luftwaffe, especially as a night fighter. Knowing the Moskito's secret was its strong wooden construction, the RLM sought to emulate the British success by using similar techniques in the construction of a miniature fighter. The secret involved pressing two types of wood laced with a patented adhesive in an autoclave. Wood was in abundance in Germany, and the German chemical company Goldsmith made a product called Tegofilm, which would be a good bonding agent. All went well, and Focke-Wulf produced its model TA-154, now named Moskito, mimicking its RAF competitor's moniker. By now, the Luftwaffe had little choice but to rely increasingly on wood, so the Tegofilm process was used extensively. Then, one night in February 1943, RAF Bomber Command struck the town of Wuppertal and destroyed Goldsmith's only Tegofilm factory. In one of the war's examples of poetic justice, the bombing mission was guided to its target by a de Havilland Moskito. However, by now, Germany's reliance on wood for aircraft construction was locked in, and therefore a substitute resin had to be found, and indeed it was. Not that far away in Leverkusen, the dynamite company produced a cold adhesive, which was known as an ersatz, or wartime substitute product. And it was available. Focke-Wulf continued production of their TA-154 using this new adhesive. Slowly, a few of the new German night fighters started to go into service. After a few months of flying, a wing broke off a later production model.
Tank actually took the action of grounding the 154s because the glue was coming unstuck. The stuff he had used earlier on was this very good adhesive, which was totally eradicated when the factory was bombed out of existence. And the new type of glue they had was not up to that grade and was actually coming unstuck, and they had a couple of crashes.
In November of 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command asked the RLM to issue a request for an extremely economical, very light fighter. Their specifications were dictated by two simple facts on hand. Firstly, jet engines were constructed of hard-to-come-by materials, and the Argus stovepipe was not. Secondly, an Argus pulse jet had powered the Me-328, which had flown quite successfully, and was likely the cheapest powered aircraft ever produced by the RLM. Following years of miniature fighter development, the actual miniature fighter program was a very short-lived event. The required specifications were so frugal that few manufacturers even bothered to respond. The power source was to be the Argus 014 pulse jet, and construction was to be mainly of wood. There was also to be an absolute minimal use of instrumentation. This bare-bones aircraft would be less sophisticated than many basic gliders. The initial speed necessary to fire the Argus engine could be achieved by catapult, solid-fueled rockets, or towing. Either way, it was expected that literally hundreds of the types selected could be produced and used to beat back attacking Allied bombers by sheer weight of numbers. Although a selection program was undertaken, it quickly boiled down to just 3 contenders: Heinkel, Blom Voss, and Junkers. The Heinkel offering was the least difficult to achieve, although it probably didn't fulfill all of the criteria for a miniature fighter. It would require very little development. The company's designers merely had to take the existing 162 Salamanders, strip it of its BMW 003 turbojet, and replace the most valuable power plant with 1 or possibly 2 Argus pulse jets. Of course, there would have been a very considerable saving in cost and weight, but would the radically diminished end result have justified the effort? Possibly yes. As it was, there was no way that BMW could supply anything like the number of 003 jet engines needed, due to the raw materials being in such short supply. On the other hand, the airframe was a product of wood and slave labor, ingredients that Himmler's SS could always seem to find. However, the absence of the reliable Tego film bonding agent meant that the Salamander was doomed to suffer the same fate as the German Moskito. Rather, like the fatherland, they were starting to fall apart. The second competitor in the miniature fighter competition, Blom and Voss, had built some of the world's largest flying boats, mammoth 6-engine aircraft, and now they were being asked to design a flea driven by a stovepipe. But loyalty prevailed and great minds took up the cause. Their design never left the drawing board, however. It still reflected the company's desire for uniqueness and the brilliant mind of Dr. Richard Vogt. The BVP-213 likely would have done everything asked of it, although Vogt had chosen to use more metal than requested. He always wanted his aircraft stronger. Had his People's Fighter with tubular steel design been chosen, then the Luftwaffe might not have been left with a fleet of disintegrating salamanders. The third competitor, the Junkers EF-126 LE, was probably more like what the RLM had expected. However, as the war had reached its final stage and the Reich was in its death throes, major services stopped and nothing was working anymore. As a result, all that Junkers had to show for their effort was a full-size wooden mock-up and the plans, together with some wind tunnel test results. And then, the RLM quickly cancelled the whole program at the end of December 1944. Even so, it's known that some calculations were still taking place in late March of 1945, just before the Soviets arrived. The Allies were anxious to snap up any scientists and technology left behind by the Reich. The great strides they had made in aerodynamics and in engine technology were assimilated into aircraft of the Cold War. Similarly, small-scale designs as those of the miniature fighter competition were toyed with and tested. The Soviets hit the miniature fighter jackpot at the Junkers plant in Dessau. There they found the wooden mock-up of the EF-126 and Junkers' best pilots and brightest designers and test pilots. They were even handed the manufacturing plans for the aircraft. The Soviets were particularly eager to develop jet aircraft of any type and quickly ordered prototypes constructed. Early glider tests were a deadly operation for even the best of Germany's test pilots. The Soviets had better luck rekindling old German technology when launching powered EF-126 from old German bombers. Though the tests were for the most part satisfactory, the pulse jet fighter idea didn't take off. The Soviets had the resources to build faster, more sophisticated jet fighters which outmatched their tiny German copies in most every way, other than cost. In 1951, Britain launched their own miniature fighter, the Fairey FD-1. About 26 feet long with a wingspan of 19 feet and with a fully loaded weight of 6,800 pounds, it certainly was as tiny as some of its German predecessors. The hopes of a nation did not rest on the Fairey Delta's shoulders, though. This was a research aircraft to see how delta wings responded at transonic speeds. Taxi tests began in May of 1950, and on March 12, 1951, it was ready for its maiden flight, piloted by Group Captain Gordon Slade. Unfortunately, the aircraft had serious and dangerous stability problems, and the problems could not be resolved with additional modifications. Though 2 more airframes had been ordered, the program was ultimately cancelled. The Lone Ferry FD-1 continued to provide research data for future delta wing projects like the FD-2 and Concorde. The Americans first dabbled with miniature fighters during the war. In 1941, Bell Aircraft took up the U.S. Army Air Force's challenge of building a small, lightweight fighter using non-strategic materials. Like Germany's miniature fighters, the XP-77 was largely made of wood. It was a low-wing monoplane fighter, armed with a 20mm Hispano cannon fired through the prop hub, 2 half-inch Browning machine guns, and optionally, a bomb or depth charge. The project was plagued with problems from the get-go. Its 500 horsepower supercharged Ranger engine wasn't ready on time, and the aircraft was overweight. Underpowered and heavy, the XP-77 was difficult to fly. The Americans also had concerns about the glue used to bind the wooden aircraft, a problem the Germans experienced with their Moskito and Salamander. The XP-77 project became less and less of a priority for Bell and the USAAF, and by 1944, it fizzled out completely. However, it wouldn't be long before McDonnell Douglas conjured up a new mini-fighter for the USAF, the Goblin. World War II ended with America becoming a nuclear power. It had successfully dropped atomic bombs on Japan from B-29 bombers. At the time, Japan had few interceptors capable of reaching the high-flying pressurized bombers. But with the dawn of the jet age and Cold War, all that would change. Jet-powered interceptors would be able to thwart an American nuclear assault against a Cold War target. The problem was no American escort fighters were available with the range and altitude to keep up with her bombers. But what if an aircraft could be made small enough to fit on board an American bomber? The McDonnell XF-85 Goblin was designed just for that purpose. At only 14 feet long with foldable wings, it was small enough to fit in the belly of a B-36 bomber. It was similar in concept to Germany's combination of an America bomber with an Me-328 parasite plane. Testing began on a specially modified B-29 in 1948. The aircraft was launched from a hand-light crane in the belly of the aircraft. Once released, the pilot could take on any incoming interceptors. When the hostiles were cleared from the sky, it was time for the Goblin's toughest assignment, getting back into the bomber's belly. Turbulence made this a challenge, and during the first test, McDonnell test pilot Edwin Schoch crashed into the crane and plummeted back to the ground. He was, however, able to make an emergency belly landing and save the Goblin and his own life. Though the aircraft was repaired and refinements were made, the program was cancelled. The Goblin would not be a match for the new Soviet interceptors it might tangle with on the way to target. As well, the development of air-to-air refueling meant that conventional jet fighters could serve as escorts. The miniature fighter competition was born from the desperation of a country on the brink of defeat with limited resources and an ample supply of imagination. Imagination that spawned a slew of other diminutive fighters throughout World War II designed for highly specialized missions. Some concepts were more successful than others, as Germany took a kind of shotgun approach in an attempt to create war-winning designs. In the end, as resourceful as the Germans were, they lacked the resources and manpower to reverse their fortunes.
As far as aviation in the Second World War, as far as aerodynamics, now the Germans were extremely advanced. There's no doubt about that. The swept wing, for example, was certainly the idea. Rocketry, certainly very advanced in that regard. But they didn't have the resources. They didn't have the time. They were not focused. A number of people tend to think of Nazi Germany as a monolith because you have a dictatorship, you have a clear line of command, you decide, you do it. If you don't do it, well, you pay for it. It was quite different. It was a polyarchy. It was complete chaos. It was a 15-ring circus. You had people doing all sorts of things, going in every direction. The Luftwaffe was like that. The army was like that. Weapons development was like that. It was complete mayhem.
A handful of miniature fighters were experimented with after the war, and although they did provide research data, they could not outperform larger conventional aircraft of the day. In the end, the miniature fighters are an interesting footnote in aviation history. They had little impact on the outcome of the war, other than to drain some of Germany's resources.
It is the aftermath of the war to end all wars, and Europe begins to pick up the pieces. While many Germans find the limits imposed on them under the Treaty of Versailles restrictive, a loophole leaves them free to experiment with rocket power, not yet considered an instrument of modern war. The VFR, a spaceflight society founded in Breslau, Germany, gathers together many rocketry enthusiasts. From just 3 members at their first meeting, the society flourishes, attracting hundreds of amateur rocketeers. And in 1933, one of these amateurs has some ideas that catch the eye of the newly elected Nazis. His name is Wernher von Braun. Working under a military grant, von Braun proposes to use liquid propulsion to power rocket flight, and goes on to create the V-2 rocket. He also comes up with plans for a series of manned vertical takeoff interceptors. This exotic weapon would launch high into the air and swoop down on incoming bombers. But the German Air Ministry, unimpressed with the power of the proposed craft, cancel it in the planning stages. In 1941, Hitler's plan for an 11-month war has stretched into 2 years. The German Air Ministry has a new rocket-powered interceptor in development, one slightly more conventional than previous efforts. The Messerschmitt 163, the Comet.
If you want a brief description of it, it's like flying a runaway train.
Before design plans are even complete, General Oberst Ernst Udet orders 70 of these wonder planes into production.
You could describe the Comet as a manned surface-to-air missile. It was not designed to fly long distances. It was designed to take off, climb very fast, shoot down bombers, come back down as fast as possible, land as safely as possible, which could be a neat trick, be refueled, reloaded, and then go up again. That was the theory. In practice, it proved rather more complicated than that.
From the mind of Alexander Martin Lippisch, the Comet is a swept-wing design, but with a novel twist. there's no tail wing. Formerly the director of a glider research group, Lippisch understands the need to reduce total drag on a fast-moving aircraft. This he achieves through his tailless design. As he explains, birds have tails because birds fly slowly, but the Comet is meant to fly fast.
The original designer of that family of aircraft, the flying wings, sort of the tailless aircraft, was Alexander Lippisch. I won't try to pronounce it, but Alexander Lippisch, great aerodynamicist, extremely brilliant gentleman, had done some work before the war on tailless aircraft. He was asked to develop something of a more military nature.
Production of the prototype begins in 1941, under great secrecy. And when it's finally fitted with its Walters engine and ready for its first flight, the pilot, risking his life in the cockpit, is a man named Heini Dittmar. On October the 2nd, 1941, the Comet prototype is towed into the air by a Messerschmitt 110 and rises to an altitude of 13,500 feet. Once there, Dittmar releases himself from the 110, turns on the rocket engine, and roars forward, nearly breaking the speed of sound, and finally flying faster than 1,000 kilometers per hour.
It's so rapid, things happen so fast, that it's the only time I've ever been in an airplane I felt was a jump ahead of me.
The Comet prototype is a success, and plans for a fully operational version are given the highest priority. But as the war begins to turn against Germany, it remains uncertain whether the Comet can become operational in time. For Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain, has failed, and Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, is failing. Need for a wonder weapon is stronger than ever, but development of the Comet interceptor progresses far too slowly. And while the improved version, built to accommodate a larger engine and increased armament, is assembled and ready, its Walters engine is not. Delayed in part by mechanical errors and in part by lack of support for defensive weapons, it's not until the summer of 1943 that the engine is finally delivered. But now there are new concerns. Although an extremely reliable engine, this reliability comes at a cost. For the engine is powered by two very volatile fuels, 3 parts C-Stoff, a powerful reductant, to 1 part T-Stoff, a deadly peroxide. When mixed, these fuels react instantly and violently, thus creating a powerful rocket propellant, but a dangerous working situation.
What the Germans used was approximately 95% pure peroxide. That thing, when you put it on your skin, didn't make bubbles. It ate you, literally ate you alive. It had this extremely corrosive effect on human flesh, any flesh, which explains why the pilots and the ground crews had to wear special clothing. You had the equipment, the nozzles, the buckets, everything had to be used and segregated completely.
Fueling, cleaning and refueling of the Messerschmitt Comet is a complicated and dangerous affair. To make room for both fuel tanks in the fuselage, the plane is equipped with jettisonable wheels. Every part of the engine, fuel lines and fuel tanks must be meticulously flushed out after every use. For if even one drop of T-Stoff mixes with C-Stoff outside the engine crucible, the entire plane will explode. But finally, on June the 24th, 1943, the improved version of the Messerschmitt Comet is ready for its maiden flight. The plane is towed out to the runway, and the pilot climbs in. He makes his adjustments and prepares for takeoff. The plane starts traveling at 200 miles per hour down the runway. It jettisons its wheels, pulls up 80 degrees, and rapidly climbs to an altitude of 40,000 feet in an unheard of 3 minutes. When the plane levels off, it quickly accelerates to speeds approaching 900 kilometers per hour, faster than any Allied plane could hope to match.
It had a very, very fast dive, even with no power. And of course, it was entirely a clear weather machine, because when you ran your fuel out, you had to glide back to your airfield. The only thing was, when you got to your airfield, you had to make sure that you had no fuel at all aboard, because they were very explosive fuels, and even a hard landing and some fuel aboard would cause the whole aircraft to disintegrate.
It is more manoeuvrable around all three axes than any known airplane, and nearly 200 are produced for active service. Combat operations begin in 1944, and as expected, Allied fighters are at a complete loss as to how to react. A red version of the plane is produced, recalling aviation legend Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, although not all pilots are happy with this ominous reminder. But still, there are more problems. Because the cockpit is not pressurized, pilots suffer gastrointestinal problems and must be fed special low-fiber diets. Also, the Waltzer's engine is prone to cutting out during flight, and while the Comet is a highly efficient glider by necessity, it can become difficult to control at top speeds. As such, only very experienced combat pilots are capable of making any enemy kills. And once Allied fighters take note of the Comet's short-powered flight, they wait the plane out, pouncing on it after its engine shuts off. Finally, the superior gliding capability of the swept-wing design proves detrimental to safe landing, causing the aircraft to suddenly rise back into the air with even the slightest updraft. In short, more planes are lost to landing accidents than result in enemy kills.
Messerschmitt and the Luftwaffe certainly knew that the Comet had limitations. An improved version with a pressurized cockpit was developed, for example, the 263, which was, I believe, turned over to Junkers. So it became the Junkers 263. At a very sort of egg-like appearance, landing gear could retract, but very narrow track, different engine.
In this design, the fuselage is stretched to accommodate larger fuel tanks for longer range. The new engine is to be equipped with two chambers, one to provide power for takeoff and climbing, and the second to provide adjustable cruising power. The aircraft is designed to reach an altitude of 40,000 feet and to still have 100 minutes of fuel left for combat. And it's hoped the new retractable landing gear will prevent any further costly landing accidents. Also, the pressurized cockpit, intended to eliminate pilot health concerns, is to be fitted with a bubble canopy to improve the pilot's rear view. Had this plane become operational, it would certainly have been capable of far more combat kills than its predecessor. But by 1945, progress on the project is so slow that it's only reached the prototype stage. And when the Junkers factory is later overrun by Soviet troops, the one and only completed aircraft is taken back to the Soviet Union.
As a viable combat aircraft, its success was mixed. Given the resources that were poured into it, keeping in mind that Germany, 1943-44 resources were at a premium, you didn't have like money and stuff to throw away, one could argue they might have been better off using something else, like manufacturing other types of aircraft, piston-powered aircraft, fighters, for example. The Comet was pretty much a one-off issue. As an idea, yes, it's a gadget.
And at this point in the war, more fighter aircraft might have indeed made a difference. Now Germany is under direct attack. Air raids by the British Royal Air Force are the heaviest assault to date in the history of aviation warfare. The result of this persistent and merciless bombing is devastating. Huge firestorms are created, killing thousands. Those who don't burn to death in the streets suffocate in their shelters and basements. Germany needs a wonder weapon. But despite its innovation and high speeds, the Comet 163 is not the weapon to turn the tide of war. Since the Comet has not lived up to expectations, Germany looks for new avenues to ward off bomber attacks. On June the 6th, 1944, the Allies land at Normandy, and step by step, the German defensive lines are pushed back. Soon the British cross the Seine and finally break through the German front, taking Brussels and then Aachen by September of that year. Meanwhile, in the skies, American B-17s wreak havoc on the German mainland. After Hamburg, there's Berlin, and then there's Dresden. Germany is being brought to its knees.
Well, the Germans had this problem. They were attacked on the ground by huge forces of tanks, especially on the Eastern Front. You need powerful weapons. They were also attacked by bombers, daytime, nighttime. So they had to develop very powerful weapons for all these enemies.
And in the southwest of Germany, near the small town of Waldsee, Erich Bacham believes he is designing just such a weapon. The Bacham BA-349 Natter.
The Natter for me is utterly fascinating. It was, for not many people really appreciate it, it was the very first vertical takeoff aircraft designed for its role.
Co-founding Bacham Werks in 1941, in 1944, Erich Bacham bases much of the Natter design on Wernher von Braun's rejected 1939 proposal, a proposal Bacham discovered while working at the Fiesler Aircraft Company. Here, a series of Jordanov cutaway diagrams show the simple design of the Natter, beginning with the fuselage and subsequently showing the control column, the Walter's engine, the fuel tank cradle, the fuel tank, and finally the pilot's seat and cockpit. But in spite of its simplicity, it's an uphill battle for Bacham to obtain the support necessary to complete this project.
Initially, he took the idea to the German air ace Adolf Galland. Galland at the time was the general of the fighter air arm. Galland was watching his fighter force being decimated. He was interested in any radical idea that might reverse this trend, so he could see the potential in the Natter.
Unfortunately, however, Galland's hands are tied. While the German Air Ministry initially agreed to 150 planes, by late 1944 they cancelled the project in favour of designs further along in production. So seeing no other choice for Bacham, Galland sends him to make a deal with the devil. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS.
Bacham was granted an audience, and it was clear that Himmler wanted to take the Natter under his control. At this stage, Himmler's power was in the ascendancy.
Himmler's power may be in the ascendancy, but it's not yet unchecked. Earlier that year, he had had Wernher von Braun arrested, only to have Hitler release him 1 month later. So now, Himmler operates with some caution. But ultimately, the SS agreed to take control of the Natter project, and immediately reorder the 150 planes the Air Ministry cancelled. In response, the Air Ministry reversed their earlier decision and order 50 more for themselves. So finally, construction begins on what is quite possibly the most radical design of World War II. The fuselage is mostly a series of wooden frames covered with plywood sheeting and held together by screws and glue. Only the cockpit, itself contained within a wooden frame, is made of armour for the pilot's protection. The wings are rectangular wooden slabs without flaps or control devices, and the cruciform tail consists of 4 fins and 4 control surfaces. Interestingly enough, the Walter's engine used to power it is the same liquid propellant engine used in the Messerschmitt Comet, requiring both Seestoff and T-Stoff for fuel. However, as additional takeoff thrust is needed, a much older technology is also used. 4 solid fuel rockets, using the same black powder that had been experimented with decades earlier by enthusiastic German rocketeers, are bolted to the aft fuselage. It truly is a radical design.
The Natter was something completely different. You fired it off like a missile, vertically from a ramp, so it was even closer to the idea of the manned missile than the Comet was.
Because the Natter requires no runway, it can be built and launched from almost anywhere. And as both the plane and the pilot are meant to parachute to the ground, not land after flight, there are written instructions on the fuselage on who to call for retrieval. Also, as the Natter's accelerated rate of climb will cause the pilot to temporarily black out on liftoff, it's initially guided by ground radio control. Radically brilliant in its combination of old and new technology, the Natter nevertheless remains a dangerous experiment. And now it's time for a manned test. But who would agree to such a potentially suicidal mission? It's January 1945. The war is going very badly, and the SS, now in complete control of the Natter project, are demanding a manned launch. They begin the search for a qualified pilot, but a pilot of a very particular kind. The kind who might be convinced to accept a mission that could go disastrously wrong. The answer to their prayers is 22-year-old Lothar Sieber. A remarkably experienced pilot, he had worked for the secret KB-200 unit, flying captured Allied bombers, including American B-17s. But 2 years earlier, Sieber had lost his rank of Oberleutnant after being court-martialed on an alcohol-related charge. Demoted to a mere Gefreiter, or private first class, now his only hope of regaining his former rank is the Natter. But there is one snag: Gertrud Nardit, his fiancée. The two are engaged to be married, and the question remains, will Sieber risk his life and the future happiness of the woman he loves just for the rank of Oberleutnant?
They must have been quite deeply in love, because when prior to Sieber taking off in the Natter, he wrote a will the day before, and it's a very touching document in which he says that he leaves all his worldly goods to his fiancée, and as well as that, he said that he would be happy if she would take his name, even though they weren't married, if he should pass on.
So, on the same night he writes his last will and testament, he takes his wife-to-be to the launch site and tells her of his dream. On March the 1st, 1945, Lothar Sieber is the first pilot of the Luftwaffe, the first of the world, to man a vertical takeoff interceptor. The flight lasts 55 seconds and reaches 1,600 feet. But when the canopy is released, Sieber fails to eject himself, and he goes down with the crashing plane. The Bacham Natter's first pilot is dead. The test, a calamity. Nevertheless, in the month that follows, 3 more unmanned test launches are conducted. Shortly after that, the plane is put into operation, with a battery of 10 at Kirchheim, near Stuttgart. So it is, in April 1945, that pilots stand alert, ready at a moment's notice to launch the Natters and engage approaching enemy fighters. But the fighters don't come. The pilots are looking in the wrong direction. For the Allies no longer attack from the sky, but from the ground. On April the 20th, 1945, the US 10th Armored Division drives its tanks and troops into Kirchheim, and the next day crosses the A21 Autobahn into the Natter launch site. Fierce fighting ensues. But there are no Natter planes left for the Allies to capture. Under SS orders, they have all been destroyed. The first manned vertical takeoff interceptor never sees even one day of action. While the mere idea of a wooden supersonic plane is completely unheard of outside the chaos of the Nazi regime, had the Natter fought in battle, it certainly would have caused some damage to the Allied bombing force. For as unpractical and dangerous as it is, the Natter could still reach a height of 30,000 feet in a matter of minutes, and would be prepared to fight the enemy with a salvo of high-powered rockets.
Having no cannon, the Natter was fitted with rockets, unguided rockets, 55mm Orkans. They would be aimed visually at the pilot. Once he got close enough, he fired them at the bomber. Hopefully one or two would hit the aircraft. And once that was done, being unarmed, the pilot would sort of break up the aircraft. That's how it worked. It would pull a lever, the canopy, the cockpit section would go one way, the rear of the aircraft would go another way. Both sections would come down, hopefully in one piece, to be reused.
The end would come down by its own parachute, the front part of the fuselage would come down by its other parachute, and at a certain safe height, the pilot could actually just get out and come down by his normal parachute.
The catch is, it was another gadget. If the Comet was a bit of a risky gadget, the Natter was a very risky gadget.
Shortly after Germany's defeat, a complete but broken up Natter airframe is discovered at the German Research Institute for Gliders near Salzburg. Later, 3 more operational units are discovered in a meadow near St. Leonhard in Austria, and at least one of these units is quickly evacuated to the United States for further study. But there, the plane is scorned and scoffed at.
The Natter was not a good idea, was not a good airplane. It was completely impractical. It was damn dangerous. What were they thinking of? I mean, this question of desperation again was in the air. The Germans had all these bright ideas, so they thought. They were completely unfocused. They had all these ideas, but they went nowhere.
The last few months of the war, the Allies had such overwhelming firepower, control of the air. Whatever the Germans would have had, other than the atom bomb, wouldn't have had any effect at all.
But is it really so easy to dismiss German ingenuity? While in practice these wonder weapons certainly did not work as planned, ultimately they do lead to some very important later developments.
The Natter for me is really the precursor in concept terms to the space shuttle. You can send something up, you can get it to do its job, and then it all comes down again and you can reuse it.
For all their differences, both the Bacham Natter and the space shuttle have similarities. Both are monoplanes. Both take off vertically, use liquid propulsion and solid booster rockets, and both are initially guided by autopilot. But then these similarities shouldn't really be all that surprising. For who is the man considered the father of the United States space program but Wernher von Braun? The very same man whose original vertical takeoff proposal inspired Erich Bacham to build the Natter, thus cementing the legacy of Hitler's rocket men.
Bombing from 2,000 feet, the B-26s are rocked by the concussion. Mustang fighters of the 9th Air Force go out on continual sweeps over France against the Luftwaffe in the air and against the enemy's aerodromes and transportation facilities on the ground. Flying in formation, they head out across the channel. Gunsight aiming point cameras record action near the invasion coast. Flying through heavy flak, a fighter downs a twin-engined enemy. This German drops his flaming belly tank. And the pilot bails out. Another enemy fighter destroyed. Enemy airdromes are strafed. This is one of the reasons for the relative lack of activity on the part of the Luftwaffe against our beachhead. A barrage balloon is quickly set up on the landing strip, which was completed in record time. One of the first transport planes lands on the new strip only 2 days after D-Day to evacuate wounded. On the 12th of June, D-Day +6, cargo planes approached the coast of France on what has become a routine supply dropping mission. The C-47s released their parapacks over positions held by our advanced ground troops. Red and yellow parachutes eased down bundles of supplies near the crash-landed gliders of our airborne infantry.